Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
I'm Malcolm Webb in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, which is one of the countries where thousands of chimpanzees can still be found up in the highland forested slopes. In 4 other countries, they've already completely disappeared, and wherever they live, they're under tremendous pressure. Chimps, like humans, live in communities, they have feelings, and they use tools. These are qualities that were discovered only in the 1960s by a young British woman. She lived with chimps for many years and grew closer to them than anyone before. Miss Goodall, widely seen as the world's leading primatologist and conservationist, talks to Al Jazeera. You're one of the world's most recognised experts on chimpanzees. What's so special about them?
Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives on planet Earth. We share 98 plus of our DNA with chimpanzees. A great deal of our communication, non-verbal, is the same: kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting on the back, swaggering, shaking the fist, begging for food. You watch a group of chimps and you know exactly what they're about because we do the same. They were the first wild animals in the scientific community to demonstrate tool using and tool making. And it was that observation where chimpanzees were picking grass stems to fish for termites, but also picking leafy twigs and having to modify them, beginning of tool making by stripping the leaves and the side branches. And it was that brought in the National Geographic Society to fund my research when the first 6 months' money ran out. So, since then we've followed the life history of chimpanzees in the wild and in captivity, because we work on captive chimps as well. Learned about the different cultures in different countries. Like in West Africa, there's rocks used as hammers to open nuts. The same nuts are at Gambhir, but they don't use that. So it's a cultural tradition passed from mother to child. We've learned a great deal about the importance of the mother. Mothers have different personalities. Some are much better mothers than others. And the good supportive mothers are the ones whose offspring do well. The males get higher in the male hierarchy, and the females are better mothers. So the thing that's, for me, exciting about that is the reason I've done what I've done is I had a supportive mother too.
What were the most interesting things that you discovered and the greatest disappointments?
Well, the greatest similarities were, as I've said, in the non-verbal communication. But in addition, they actually have a kind of primitive war, and they are territorial, and the males patrol the boundaries of the territory. And if they spy an individual from a neighboring community, they will follow, give chase, keep very quiet for maybe over an hour, they're looking for individuals, and then they will kill them. They will actually kill them. So, they have war on the one hand, but also altruism and love and compassion. So in both these ways, the aggressive and the loving, they're so close to us.
And when you first made some of these discoveries, you came under quite a lot of criticism for the implications that it made about, I understand, chimpanzees, but also about humans in the press, including criticism that you, as a woman, were making discoveries about mankind, which was possibly controversial in that era. What kind of things did they say, and what did you think about that at the time?
What I was criticized for was, first of all, when I saw tool using. And the scientists said, well, she's just a woman. I hadn't been to university. We couldn't afford it. And so they wanted to disregard everything. But then when the Geographic sent Hugo van Lauwijk, and he filmed it, they could no longer deny what I'd seen. In fact, even before that, my sister came out. I said, I don't want anybody coming, but she sounds like me and she looks a bit like me. So she came with a camera and she actually filmed termite fishing. So, then they had to believe it. But the next thing was the aggressive behavior. Because at that time in the early 70s, it was a political issue. And science was divided, I guess more than science, but certainly science, as to whether human infants are born with like a clean slate, so everything is learned from your culture, from the society, from your mother. And then on the other hand, there were those who said, well, there's a lot of learning involved, and chimpanzees and human beings learn by watching each other and learning about their cultures. So it was a very political issue, believe it or not. And we had one of the first Russians, primatologists, taking part in an international conference. And when it came to aggression, before he said a word, he had to go off and telephone his boss in Moscow. So eventually I went to Cambridge University after I'd been with the chimps for 2 years. And so I had a supervisor who was wonderful for me, but he was also one of the top ethologists. And when we had this conference, he was there too. And he was on the side of everything is learned. That's what he talked about. And I was saying, no, some things are inherited. It's instinctive that we have these aggressive sides. I know as a mother, because when your child is threatened, you get this surge of adrenaline and sometimes anger. It's not rational, but it's there. So when I sat down with him to have a cup of coffee, I said, what do you really believe about whether aggression is innate? And do you know what he said to me? He said, Jane, I'd rather not talk about what I really believe. And that gave me such a bad attitude towards science. I thought, how can you be like this?
So do you think science has progressed since then in its understanding of these things?
Mainly the people who you know, don't believe in all this inherited stuff and don't believe that animals have personalities and emotions and so forth. They're mostly the people who are either in primate research labs where animals are tortured still, or intensive farming, and we know how cows and pigs are treated, chickens and turkeys. So it's mostly those people who don't want to admit that animals have personalities, minds, and above all, emotions. And one interesting observation, which I never forgot, when you're thinking about different personalities, the alpha male at that time, Mike, I think it was Humphrey, anyway, an aggressive male. So when an infant began screaming because his mother wouldn't nurse him, the aggressive male went and attacked the infant for screaming. So of course the infant screamed more, and that blew any chance of seeing a stranger. However, another male on another occasion with the same infant, old Hugo, was a much more gentle individual, and when the infant made a noise, he went and embraced him. So you see the difference in the two personalities? This is what's so fascinating. They're as different from each other as we are.
You're going to Gambhir Island. What's there and why are you going?
When I first came to Uganda, it was in the mid-60s, and it was in the days of Idi Amin. And at that time there was the Entebbe Zoo, and they had, I think, about 8 or 9 infant chimps whose mothers had been shot for bushmeat. And they didn't have proper cages, they didn't know anything about them. They were in really wire netting cages. They had nothing to do, they were very disturbed. And so I managed to find a zookeeper from London Zoo who volunteered, and her parents gave her a car so she could get around. And gradually that built up cages, proper cages, and introduced, you know, for chimps and many other animals too, boredom is one of the awful things you see in bad zoos. They have nothing to do. Think of their lives in the wild, and then think of being confined in a small space. So one of the things that she did was give them paper and paintbrushes. Some of them paint lovely, not a picture, but they make fan shapes or circular shapes, and began selling them, which raised money. So that was the beginning of it. And from that, it led to some of the chimps being relocated onto an island, I don't know its name, but somewhere near the zoo. And then we wanted to create a proper sanctuary for the chimps. So the island was created for orphan chimps whose mothers were either killed for bushmeat or they were poached so that the infants could be sent off and sold as pets or entertainment in foreign countries, so they'd get confiscated. So it was a mixture of mothers shot for different reasons.
Conservation projects in Africa, even though we're half a century after the end of European colonialism, continue to be dominated by white foreigners. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not sure that it always is true. I'm not sure. I think African politicians, Africans in all walks of life, women are coming up and taking their rightful position in society. And we've got past the time when women, in order to succeed, decided they have to have male characteristic of aggression and pushiness. Now women are beginning to fall into place with the characteristics that make women, I think, a little bit different. You know, nurturing, compassion because of the infants that we raise. So yes, there is some male dominance and money coming in from outside, but it's changing. You can't expect change to happen overnight after our brutal colonialism, which actually destroyed some of the best people who might otherwise have taken over more quickly. I mean, we ruined their culture. We ruined so much about African society.
Before European colonialism, then this was one continent, maybe the last continent in the world where humans did live in a relatively sustainable way with wildlife. And when the European colonialists came, they hunted at a rate never done before, they destroyed habitats at a rate never seen before, and then created nature reserves in almost every country, which involved, of course, displacing people off the land, and to this day many of those communities live on the periphery of those parks, still in poverty, having lost access to the natural resources they once had. Do you think that the preservation of this wildlife has simultaneously been a story of great injustice for many communities in this continent?
Huge injustice. I mean, what white colonialists did, I think, can never really be forgiven in Africa, because I've traveled to many different countries, and everywhere the history of white colonialism is brutal. And so when finally the Europeans thought, oh gosh, we've killed off nearly all the animals, oh yes, we can develop tourism, how lovely. So and some of them actually cared about the animals. So we began to set up these national parks. And as you say, people were driven out of those areas and lived in the peripheral, and many of them in poverty. And of course, those communities were growing. Human population growth is a huge problem. So it was in 1986 that there was this big conference in which it became very obvious that chimpanzee numbers were dropping right across Africa. And that's when I decided to leave research. I didn't know what I could do. So the first thing I thought I would do is to travel around some of the African countries where there were chimp populations. I think it was 7 different countries, but also learning about the horrible problems faced by so many of the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitat. You know, the crippling poverty in some cases, the lack of good education, the lack of good health, and ethnic violence, which is getting worse because of that. And it came to a head when I flew over the Gambhir National Park in a tiny plane and looked down. Gambhir was once part of this equatorial belt that stretched from East Africa and curled through southwest Tanzania, through Burundi, Uganda, and then right to the West African coast through the Congo Basin. And when I flew over in 1990 and looked down, it was an island of forest, a tiny island of forest. It's the smallest national park in Tanzania, surrounded by completely bare hills. More people living there than the land could support. They'd been moved from their traditional villages. They were supposed to be doing communal farming, and that was not European, by the way. And they were struggling to survive. And this is when it hit me. If we don't do something to help the people, we may as well give up conservation. I'm very well aware of the problem you speak of when they've been forced out of the forest. That's happened in Burundi, and I think it's happened in Rwanda as well. But I know about the Burundi ones. And it is shocking. It's really heartbreaking to see them thrown out of the forest. Of course, there's been this genocide with Rwanda, and we're trying to work with them.
There's a lot of people in Africa, in many countries in Africa, who are making a lot of money from wildlife trafficking or from destroying habitats for wildlife. I mean, there are many millions of dollars to be made from this every year, and powerful people behind it. In your work, have you run into conflict with these people? Have you ever been threatened or anything like that by the people whose interests you're challenging?
Well, I haven't actually been threatened. Nobody from Gombe's been threatened, and I truly believe that's because we've always worked with the people ever since, those early days. It's certainly true. You've got your fossil fuel industry, you've got logging, you've got, as you say, the animal trafficking, and various other problems caused by us. And all you can do is to tackle them one by one. But after raising money for our different Jane Goodall Institute programs across Africa, I began traveling around the developed world to raise money, but also to raise awareness, just because of the problem you're talking about, that it was our society that were raiding the forests for timber and so forth, and the Africans who were just making money out of it, and poaching and so forth. So that's when I thought, unless we have new generations growing up to understand better our relationship with the natural world, then soon there will be nothing left, and we'll suffer. So that's when I began our Roots and Shoots program. And it was basically, because I understand the diversity in the rainforest, how everything is interconnected. From the very beginning, we had our Roots and Shoots groups will work on 3 different interrelated problems to help people, to help other animals, because we are animals too, and to help the environment.
And do you work with many of the governments or heads of state or senior politicians in the countries where these endangered species are found?
I let the people, each Roots and Shoots in each country does that sort of thing itself. But
or
we're
through any
careful.
of your other programs, do you work with authorities a lot?
Well, the point is that we try to be completely apolitical. So in the US, for example, if we work with a Democrat, we'll also work with a Republican, and that sort of thing. I'm not sure about now, but the old days, it worked.
I was wondering if it's possible to be apolitical, going back to the wildlife trafficking, smuggling, timber concessions in Africa, in the countries where many of these endangered species or precious habitats are found, then it's not possible to run a multi-million-dollar racket under the radar of the people in power. In fact, it's not possible to run it without the complicity of the people in power, and we've seen many leaked documents or wildlife investigations over the years that have implicated heads of state and very senior politicians in these things. So surely it's not possible to separate the politics from the very greatest threats to conservation.
That's true, but with JGI, we don't directly tackle the government in a political way. We go and meet with people in the government and talk to them, and that's kind of different. So, but I'm not pretending that I know the extent to which the Jane Goodall Institute in Uganda is working in the government. You would have to talk with Peter Appel, who runs the program here. But by and large, it's sharing information, it's reaching people's hearts. That's the key.
So you're also a patron of Population Matters, which advocates for a voluntary reduction in human population to try and create some sustainability for people and everything else. I wanted to ask you about how this could possibly be achieved, and give the example of China as the only government that's ever actually tried to address population reduction, but they didn't do it in a voluntary way, and it's widely seen by many as a human rights abuse and caused a great deal of unhappiness for a very large number of people. Is there a way, or is there another way to reduce the human population?
Well, I'm only going to talk about what I know about. And what I know about is our Dakari program in Tanzania around the chimp habitat, where we began working all those years ago. Now there, people are coming up and asking for, ways in which they can control their population. And so we provide all the things the women need. We've had men coming and asking for vasectomies. And the point is that now they're more in control of their own lives. They're realizing, we just don't have the natural resources to grow our populations. So their culture is changing. Instead of wanting a lot of children, they want to have 2 or 3 children so that they can give them a good education and so that they won't be starving. We've watched it change. And so we have family planning initiatives in every one of these villages that I talked about, 75. And it's worked. So we didn't push it on them, it's their own people. They do it, we don't do it. And this is the secret, I think.
They're also still increasing, carbon emissions are still increasing year on year, and United States of America recently pulling out of the Paris Agreement.
And opening coal mines.
Right. And scientists even saying that the Paris Agreement wouldn't save us from the point of no return, as they call it anyway. Things don't look very optimistic there either, but what do you think?
Well, all I can say is that I know many people in the US who are taking matters into their own hands. And Trump was elected. I don't know what the future is in the United States. I can't predict it. Some people say he'll be re-elected, which will be very harmful. But on the other hand, like, take California. He even wants to secede. They are taking their own environmental problems into their own hands. And it's working in California. It's definitely working. And there are other states as well.
And at this time of changing climate, destroying habitats, reducing natural resources and the things that we've talked about, is there anything that you've learned from chimpanzees that humankind would be well advised to pay attention to right now?
Well, one thing I really think is maternal behavior, because we're in danger in our modern society with women playing an ever larger role, which they should. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but it's really important if you're going to go on with your career and have children. Maybe you're not a maternal type, but you must ensure that your child has 1, 2, 3 stable people in the child's life who will be there to give support, to give nurture. If they're unhappy, to not just an hour in the evening of quality time, that's not enough. That's something different. Also, they're really good at making up quarrels. So you have a big fight, and sometimes it's so bad that the victim will run away. But if it's not too bad, then it's usually a male who's the aggressor. And very often it's a female adolescent male who's been the victim of a fight. And the big male is sitting there with his hair out. And the victim will come up crouching, screaming, but begging for reassurance with a hand out like this. Or sometimes they're so frightened that they've got their back to the big male and they'll reach back like this. So once the big male pats the hand, and sometimes that ends up with an embrace, social harmony is restored. And we're not too good at that.
What is your message to young people today?
Well, the message is basically the Roots and Shoots message. You are an individual, you matter. You have different options in front of you, but the first thing, people come up to me, young people, high school, and they say, I really, I want to make a difference, I don't really know what to do. So I usually advise them, if they're going on to university, to take a gap year and to leave their minds open. I said, you will probably find something that will make you say, this is what I want to do. And you can't imagine the number of young people who've said, I took your advice and I went around, visited different countries, and I suddenly knew what I wanted to do. And then they go all out for it. And that's I think the most important thing is to be passionate about what you do.
Jane Goodall, primatologist and conservationist, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
It's been a great pleasure.